End of the year. Tēnā koutou katoa, welcome to the seminar where we have two outstanding Indigenous scholars from North America who we're really fortunate to have visit us, courtesy of Ngā Pai o Te Maramatanga and Te Kotahi Research Institute and School of Māori and Pacific Development. We're going to start with Gregory, and he will do his presentation. I'll assess time in terms of time for questions, and then we'll have Karina, and then after that we invite you to have lunch in A block in SMPD tea room. So I want to start by introducing Gregory Cajete, who I've known for years, and he really is a significant, a major figure in Indigenous knowledge. He's got the most fascinating background of being both an artist and heading an Institute of Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico, also writing about native science and environmental education. And I think my first awareness of Greg was through his book, Look to the Mountain, which is one of a number of books that Gregory has written. He's at the University of New Mexico and is from a pueblo. Santa Clara Pueblo, which I first visited in the 1960s with my father, who was doing some work in the pueblo. Very different cultures to the ones that maybe people are familiar with when they think of North American Indians. So Greg can talk more to his background, but please welcome Associate Professor Gregory Cajete.
Sengi herende, as we say in my language, which is good morning to all of you. It's really a pleasure to have this opportunity to, share my thoughts and, as we would say, share my breath with you in the context of, this discussion, this reflective presentation. So, as they set me up here, just a little bit about my background. As Linda mentioned, I come from Santa Clara Pueblo, which is one of 6 Tewa-speaking pueblos in New Mexico. And at one time, actually, we were quite a large group. We had both a northern branch of Tewa and also a southern branch of Tewa. And of course, if you may or may not know that the pueblos were colonized essentially first by the Spanish, and of course went through all of the kinds of issues of colonization and such with the Spanish. And in 1680, the pueblos rose in revolt against the Spanish, led primarily by the Tewa tribes, and drove the Spanish out of New Mexico for a period of almost 15 years, and then reestablished their cultural and spiritual sovereignty. When the Spanish came back, they knew that potential of revolt was still there, so in some ways then began to systematically allow for certain kinds of expressions of self-determination on the part of Pueblo groups particularly, and that included recognizing essentially our traditional governments and also allowing us our lands, our homelands to remain intact. And so we have a little bit different history than most of the tribes of the United States in the sense that we were not removed from our homelands or placed on reservation as many tribes were in the United States, and that also allowed us to have a continuity to our communities, through time and through history. And of course, then we were under the Mexican government for a period of time, and then In 1848, because of the Mexican-American War, we were ceded to the United States, and the United States, only because of the treaty with Mexico, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, was obliged to recognize our homelands. So that made the difference in terms of our ability to continue to, at least in some basic ways, although we had to adopt Catholicism on the surface, the church turned its head away when we would do what we had always done in the context of our ceremonies and our traditions, and certainly that allowed us to maintain our languages. So we are a little bit different than most of the tribes in the United States in that sense of history. Not that we don't have the same issues that all indigenous people have as a result of colonization and now with the resurgence of Indian self-determination in the United States. But my presentation today actually is about my current work. I've done a lot of different writings. I'm currently wrapping up a new writing on the pedagogy of indigenous community. And so some of that thinking is going to come out in this presentation. The reason I'm looking at community, because my first book, which is Look to the Mountain, really attempted to address the question, what is indigenous education? What do we mean when we ask ourselves the question, that question, what is indigenous education to us? And so I did a comprehensive research as well as I could in that time. It was almost 20 years ago since I wrote the book, about what that meant. What does that mean when indigenous people describe their ways of teaching and learning and understanding and coming to knowledge in the world, their epistemology, if you will. And so this book was in and of itself has a story, but I won't get into that. But originally, the need to understand that question, what is indigenous education, was because at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, I was asked by the president of the school at that time, Lloyd New, to create a curriculum that integrated science with art, with the cultural perspectives of the students that were coming from the Institute. And indeed, they came from throughout the United States, various levels of traditionality and understanding of their traditions. But they were, what held them together is that they came to school to learn about the arts. And so he was very interested in ensuring that they not only learned about the arts, but they also learned about how science and how their own cultural histories, fitted into that bigger picture, that curriculum. So Ignite the Sparkle evolved essentially as a curriculum research, which was focused on that project of how do you create a curriculum that integrates science with art, with the cultural perspectives of students. And this was in 1974. So we were beginning to explore what we would be calling culturally based instruction, even in those days, and trying to find ways to affect those changes, within the school settings that we were a part of. And so Ignite the Sparkle evolved from that kind of thinking. I've since written another book called The Spirit of the Game, which is about indigenous games as pedagogy. And as I said, I'm currently writing a book on community as indigenous community as pedagogy. Native science, I think, is still circulating in the world. And that is a book about actually the content that we used to teach based on this curriculum, that I created at IIA. So, and I've also done some, chapters in various other kinds of books, so you may have seen those. But this is really my current work. I've really become involved with, because I'm also trained as a plant ecologist. My first degree is actually in biology with a focus on plants and also with a training as a general scientist in the realm of field studies. And so my early work was, and my early intention was actually to become a field biologist, you know, somewhere out in the world. I would have given David Suzuki a run for his money. But what happened is that I was asked to create a curriculum that, in a sense, moved me in a completely different direction that I had even known I would move in. And that was really the whole world of Native education, indigenous education, and then as a result of that, getting into indigenous epistemologies, you know, as an area of study, and then also the expressions of Native science, you know, by different indigenous groups, and we have a richness that's still largely, I think, untapped. And then finally, you know, this work with sustaining and sustainable communities. Because as I researched, you know, these various kinds of areas, I always knew that there was a connection between all of them. And then that question, what is indigenous education, you know, keeps coming back. It echoes back to you as you do this kind of journey of research. So what happened was that I asked myself that question again, what is indigenous research? At the same time, there's this field of sustainability and sustainability science that has really literally grown in the last 10, 15 years, largely because of global climate change and all of the issues with sustainability and those kinds of issues have brought into being a kind of new integrated science, which we now call sustainability science. And I asked myself the question, what is indigenous education? Well, it's really about sustaining people, culture, in a place, through generations, through time, in a way that they realize well-being, they realize the fruits of their labor, they realize an understanding of themselves as a people. And so if I were to ask the question, what is indigenous education? You know, it really is an education of sustainability. It is an education for sustainability, but it's sustaining not only culture and people, but it's also sustaining of a land base, of a place. You know, that goes in tandem with the evolution and development of the people in place. And so that's why I use now the word sustainability extensively to mean an aspect of indigenous knowing and indigenous understanding that I think we are now able to begin to revisit. Also because sustainability science is actually open to the indigenous view. Up until that point, even the ecological environmental movement, environmental science, was still very much Western science. And while they would use indigenous thought as a kind of antidote, it wasn't really allowed to, in a sense, even invited into the realm of the development of this new field of science. But what I've seen and what I've talked with many of the founders of this field of integrated science, because it includes not only science, but it includes health, it includes community, it includes culture, it includes art, because it takes all of those kinds of sites of research to begin to, in a sense, establish or reestablish this movement towards and this focus on sustainability. So this slide is a 1,000-year-old rather Mimbres plate. The Mimbres people were the cousins of the Anasazi. They lived in southern New Mexico, southern Arizona, and also northern Mexico. And the only thing they left of themselves is their record of who they were through their wonderful and amazing art forms, story pots. And so this is a 1,000-year-old Anasazi plate. I use it as my icon because for me it represents a whole philosophy, a whole epistemology. Because if you look at that form, there's a human effigy and then there's a sandhill crane, but they're not two designs. It's a positive, negative image. So you can't pull apart the membres or the membres man figure there from the sandhill crane figure. Or you destroy the whole, you destroy both in terms of the image. And so that's a profound perspective of understanding that the human is the sandhill crane is the human, that you can't pull them apart in either in terms of this design or in terms of the greater whole. And so part of this this new work really is beginning to look at what is the nature of the reemergence of indigenous thought. What does that mean for us in this time and in this place, and also what is it going to mean in the future? And so that's a question about what we're going to do with our newfound either political or economic or cultural capital, and how we're going to, in a sense, parlay that into this journey and this continued movement of sustainability and sustaining ourselves as indigenous people into the next generations. And so that's a very important question. But all over the world, you can see that indigenous people are rising, especially through the mechanism of education, to begin to take hold of and, in a sense, decolonize, but also, in a sense, reform their thoughts, their perspectives, their understandings of themselves through the arts, through the humanities, through history, through studies programs. And then, especially now, I think the real challenge is to break into the bubble of Western science and begin to do this kind of work in a direct way. And so this emergence, and this is actually a ceremonial cave. We're facing the east, and as you emerge into the sunlight, that's one of those understandings that I think we have to think about. Through the indigenous eye. So this is an artist, Conrad House, a good friend of mine, passed away. But his collage, he uses pastels in some very beautiful ways, but he calls this piece In the Indigenous Eye. And so it evokes that thought and that perspective of what it is to look at the world through the indigenous eye. And what do you see in the indigenous eye? But you see essentially the interdependencies and the interconnections of plants, of animals, of human beings, of the corn, of eagle, of hummingbird, of turtle, of antelope, of bear, of the sun, star, and moons. And so, in a sense, that reemergence of indigenous thought is also a reemergence of learning how to look through the indigenous lens once again, and to, in a sense, invite that kind of vision that is a part of understanding those interdependencies and those interrelationships that are part of that particular piece. You know, as I was researching what is indigenous education, I never really found a word that in any indigenous language that referred to quote-unquote education as it is referred to in the Western sense. But I did find many metaphors that describe the process of coming to know something, which would be, in a sense, epistemology. And it was many times described as a pathway through a landscape, both physical as well as metaphysical, that, in a sense, describe what was meant by indigenous people when they described education. And so that pathway, that idea, and of course in the pathway, you know, you have many stops and many points in the path where you can take one road or another road. And so it's always a pathway where decisions are required in terms of where you're going to go next. That idea, that perspective of choice. Among my people, we have a lot of relationships to mountains because we're desert people, and it's really the mountains and the snowfall and the watersheds of those mountains that feed our communities that life-giving water, from which that life-giving water to feed our communities come from. And so water and mountain are tied in some very intimate ways. that then goes into the formation of our major river, which is the Rio Grande, just like the Waikato is here. And so, look to the mountain is another metaphor I used to describe, in a sense, as I wrote, look to the mountain, that idea that, as one elder stated, when you're trying to understand something, you have to look at it as if you're looking at it from the top of a mountain. So there's a trail that you go to in climbing the mountain. There's a place that you arrive at the top of the mountain. And then there's a perspective that you see all around you, the vision that you see, other mountains, other valleys. And that's that perspective of the future. So it's past and present and future that have to be considered in the context of Indigenous education. That forms the foundation, essentially, of Indigenous education. So, we have, as Indigenous people, a strong sense of our cultural history, a strong sense of our lineage, of the histories of our people. We're also practical in the sense that we have a sense of the present and what you need to get done in the present moment. The other piece of that is where you're going to go next. That vision from the top of the mountain to see what are the next places that you need to go in this journey, in this process. So it was an appropriate metaphor, that role of vision and higher purpose in Indigenous education. The other piece of this is engaging the creative spirit. And so we have a form called the kokopelli that is the creative spirit of procreation, almost like the Pan figure, but also is a very sacred figure. It's both male and female, and plays a special kind of music, is a seed bringer, spreads news and information and perspective and illumination, if you will. And so you have the kokopelli in many different contexts, in many different kinds of ancient petroglyphs in the Southwest. And when you see that petroglyph, you know that particular panel of petroglyphs is something important. It's a story that talks about something that is important to think about in terms of a life journey and the life process. We have, as Indigenous people, many kinds of ceremonies, and the Pueblos, we have numerous kinds. But I wanted to use this one particularly because I think it's a good example that sort of exemplifies other ceremonies, And so the people of the Northwest, celebrate the coming of the first salmon as a kind of community renewal, community remembering process. And so there are stories, I won't go into those stories, but there are stories that sort of bring together the community around remembering to remember why the salmon are important to those people, what their relationship to the salmon are, how to take care of the salmon so that they continue to spawn and continue to visit the people. There are big celebrations, of course, potlatches where material goods are exchanged and on and on and on. And so I know that the Maori have these kinds of celebrations, but Indigenous people, in a sense, have celebrations primarily to, in many cases, form community and to remind the community of what is important to the life of that community. That is one of the primary purposes of ceremonies, to remind you about what is important. And that sustainability piece, that piece that we call sustainability today, is very much a part of that thinking. So in many ways, what we've been involved with, for really the last, many years, I've lost count already, is recreating Indigenous education in a way that allows us to once again express those central core values, those understandings of who we are as a people, and to project that not only in terms of the present, but also into the future. So, teaching and learning, which is transformative and anticipates change, is essential, for the evolution of indigenous education. So it's not just learning the history, and it's not just really learning the language. It's really about what are you going to use those tools for in terms of ensuring and sustaining the future. And so that becomes a very important initiative in indigenous education. Indigenous education actually is a very fluid kind of container. It can integrate and apply principles of sustainability along with appropriate community and also environmental knowledge. That's why I think sustainability as a concept, not so much just of what is going on, in mainstream society around sustainability studies or sustainability science, but sustainability as a concept for indigenous education is very important to begin to unpack and to begin to think about, what we do as indigenous people using that lens, using that understanding. Because it's very fluid. You can incorporate almost anything in the sustainability concept as long as it fulfills the principle and leads you to that focus of sustainability. So, for me, indigenous education does form that foundation for renewal, revitalization, reconnection, and in a sense, revisioning what we are and who we will be as indigenous people. One of the things that I also do a lot of work with global climate change and the effects of global climate change. And if there's anything globally that has finally, well, I don't know, I can say it has caused a wake-up of society, but at least it's there, is global climate change. And it's helped, I think, a lot of people to realize that we are indeed riding the great turtles back, the mother turtles back, and that we are all ultimately all related because we are part of this earth and we are connected, to the earth and her processes. And so that idea, that concept, that perspective of Turtle Island is something that has now become, I think, a very important global site of indigenous education as we begin to think about that future. I use this slide to sort of describe what are the 4 foundations of indigenous education. Well, there's traditional knowledge, which is handed down based on the stories and experiences of a people through time. So that's our history. There has always been an empirical knowledge, gained through careful observation and practiced over time. There has always been a tradition of revealed knowledge gained through vision and through ritual and through ceremony. And then there is now a contemporary form of knowledge, gained through experience, problem solving, and research. This is contemporary education. So as you think about, what are the 4 directions, sitting the indigenous thinking in the middle of that. These are the well springs that feed us in varieties of ways, at varieties of time, to, in a sense, move us along, in this context of the evolving nature of indigenous thinking, indigenous knowing. And so it's within that context that indigenous thinking, comes. So we have traditional, empirical, contemporary knowledge, interfacing with each other. And it's not just something out there, it's also something in you. If you're an indigenous person doing indigenous research, this is all happening in you, as much as it is happening outside of you. And so you have to realize that that's the process. It's an inner-outer kind of reflection, action type of spiral. So, my creation stories, or as we call them, emergent stories, talk about these kinds of things. They talk about, in their metaphoric traditional form of language, they talk about the emergence into successive worlds of being. Each world requires that that the people who are on that journey, that rainbow road, have to learn something about themselves, have to learn something about their relationship to the world that they are living in before they can emerge into the next level of being. So it's a very evolutionary concept. We call it the emergence myth. And so successive generations go through these ages of I guess you would say evolution, but also have to learn, or they don't survive. There's a lot in this story that talks about the people that didn't survive and that were not able to emerge into those next worlds. And so, again, Kokopelli being one of the purveyors of those kinds of stories. So I say that all foundations of indigenous knowledge can provide models, creative insights necessary to renew and revitalize the health of human communities and economies. You see, because it's not the individual that survives through time. It's really the extended family and the community that survives through time. And I think many know that this is one of the reasons why genealogies are so important, because it's a map of the continuity of a lineage of a community and also of a people through time. So those ideas, those perspectives. This is one of the hard things to do because it's in a contemporary life. It's very easy, especially in the developed countries, to take everything for granted, and we then become very complacent and apathetic with regard to what we have. So as concerned people, we have to take a look at those, an honest look at those current health, educational, economic, institutional, governmental, community development policies, planning processes, which may make us complicit with the status quo. And this is something that tribes have to know and understand. This is what leaders have to know and understand, because when you put this lens, up against decisions that are made, by leadership, then you begin to see some very interesting dynamics. So, this is part of that new awareness that in order to be an indigenous leader, you really do have to have that sense of past, present, and future, but you also have to have a self-critical awareness of what you're doing and why you're doing it and how it is complicit or not complicit in a certain situation. I'm currently director. I created programs at the Institute of American Indian Arts, and now I'm at the University of New Mexico, retiring I think very soon. But one of the focus was to recreate or create, reassemble our Indigenous Studies program, our Native Studies program, around some of these principles and ideas. Because I am ultimately an educator. And one of the things I do, like that Kokopelli, is I plant seeds and I try to get things to grow, based on some ideas and perspectives and some understandings that I have. So it's really that we're involved with a new kind of enterprise, developing, in my case, a new kind of Native education that's predicated on guiding people, Native people, towards that vision of health, revitalized, economically viable communities. Indigenous research then becomes research as story, research as a process for coming to know, research as knowledge creation to increase well-being, and also as a process of empowering both the researchers as well as the communities that are researched. And so that becomes, in a sense, the mandate, of this kind of work of regeneration of indigenous education in a contemporary sense with an eye towards that future. I've gotten involved also because of that, in a lot of research, especially research evaluation. And so these are some of the guidelines that after lots of thinking and reflection, we've sort of come to. that research and evaluation is based on Indigenous values and beliefs. It is knowledge creation. It's always about people and place. It highlights personal gifts that are discovered, not only on the part of the researcher and research team, but also on the part of what you find in the community. It's a community focus, a family focus. It's ultimately about what we call deep sovereignty. It's not just superficial sovereignty where you're dealing primarily with the law and with those kinds of policies, but it's how are the people themselves becoming sovereign and taking and making decisions on their own. You know, how do you empower that, create the capacity for that? In that kind of process of thinking, context is critical. Place-based programs are critical. Place-based study is critical. Looking at the whole person and whole community is critical. Community research, research that affects our families and our communities, and the development of ownership and capacity. So as you think about this, you know, you begin to take a look at how we can begin to develop this kind of research agenda, even more so than we are already doing. Again, framing research in Indigenous community, Indigenous metaphors of research. You may notice I use metaphors a lot. I know it drives a lot of my research colleagues, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, who are still holding on to the Western model of research and thinking. It drives them crazy. I drove someone, as Karina will remembers, I drove someone to the brink of chewing his pencil, you know, the other day. But it's because we have to think now in those terms. So Indigenous metaphors of research are amazing wellsprings. And they're right there in the language. If you, we have a body of language, of lyrical and sung poetry, of stories that contain these gems. And part of this work is about mining those gems, you know, to find ways for them to reveal not only their wealth, but also to help us in thinking and rethinking about these issues, these situations. So I really encourage you, you know, when it's possible, to use Indigenous metaphors. But if you use Indigenous metaphors, go deeply into what they mean, you know, and into what they actually mean. So, you know, creating knowledge which benefits the community, building on core values, creating guiding stories through research. You know, the other thing is that research itself is a story. You know, when you embark on a research process, you really are embarking on a script, the development of a story. The research of what's happening in the community itself is a story, but the research itself is a story. And those stories have to be told and retold and reflected on, because it's a way to build, you know, new research from, new stories from. Building the Indigenous scaffolding for research is simply, you know, that research never ends. Once you start it, there's yet another level, and yet another level, and yet another level. So be careful about what you decide to research, because you may be researching it for a long, long time, and it better be something you like to research. So building that scaffolding, and then community evaluation and reporting, engaging, educating, and capacity building all the time, all the time. So that also is a curriculum, you see, is that you also, through research, creating a curriculum of process, and that the products and the outcomes of that research then become material for new curriculum. So always think in terms of that. Develop an ecological, and I would say now ecological / sustainable view of Indigenous research. That there is that integrity that starts from the premise that what you do has integrity and honors life-giving relationship. So you see with that sustainability piece, there's also a life-sustaining piece for Indigenous people. In my language, the term is woatsigi, for life's sake we do this. And that itself is a metaphor that, in a sense, really pegs that into the deeper levels of why you're doing something. For life's sake we do this. For your life, for the community's life, for the life of family, for the life of the place in which you live, etc. Build in that sustainable orientation which sustains community culture and place. Always make that research, make that education process a part of a vision and purpose. See what you can do in the light of revitalization of community. So that vision and purpose is that view that you have from the top of the mountain as you begin to look at what is before you and what you can do with that. Purpose and actions originate through spiritual agency that stems from connections to a cultural way of being. Spiritual agency. That unlike Western, I call Western research the sterilized research. Unlike sterilized research, Indigenous research does have always, in one shape or form or another, a spiritual element in it. You know, it changes you, or it should change you. You know, and it also should change and affect, you know, the bringing forward of that spiritual expression in some shape or form. Respect for all. Actions stem from respect for and celebration of community and engagement. As I've said before, the community is both the medium and the message, the medium and the beneficiary of activities. It's about relationship, and we all know that, but the 3 R's are relationship, 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 okay? Build upon and extend relationships are essential. Restoring and extending health is the goal. Every initiative should generate, after it is done, new dynamic processes and relationships. So that's why I say research is never done, that the research has to have something built into it that extends and builds and evolves into the next stage, into the next level. It's about teaching in family and community. You know, sometimes I see that what's missing, even in Indigenous research, is that follow-up. That itself is a methodology. That whatever that research is about, that there needs to be a context as well as a way to dialogue and deepen the understandings, the learnings, and the teachings of that research project. So in a Western sense, we're taught to, okay, here's the report, that's it, let's go. You know, it's never like that. It's never like that. It should not be like that. It should not be like that. So commitment to developing those skills of deepening the intent and capacity and process of the research. Commitment to that community renewal, commitment to mutual reciprocal action and transformative change. Because that's the way you build change, you know, through time, is that one thing leads to another thing, leads to another thing, both horizontally and vertically. You know, that is really how you get the biggest bang for the buck. See, I have to tell you that the Western system of research is not set up to do that. The bang goes to the university or to whoever is the sponsor of that university, but it doesn't have a horizontal kind of expansion. And it certainly doesn't go deeper many times, you know, in terms of changing things in that transformative sense. So we have to make that happen ourselves. So, you know, I'm going to just kind of tie it up with simply saying that, you know, this education for recreation around Indigenous paradigms begin with the history of your principles, of your Indigenous way of education, translate that into the present, research the practical ways that it can be applied. We have a lot of things that we have that we can do and are doing. Collaboration and cooperation is essential. At that community level, the reason for dialogue around the research is to enhance, because you think that collaboration and cooperation just happen. Well, they don't. You have to actually create contexts in which you practice that. You continually practice that. And I think many of our indigenous communities in some ways have to relearn that. And research is a way to help community relearn that. So, as you think about these thoughts and these perspectives of what it is to, this concept of sustainability, it really does come into, I think, its own in terms of the kind of work that we are already doing. It's another kind of conceptual framework that I think has a lot of room for the indigenous mind to play with, to bring forward. Because a lot of my work has been how to get more Native students into STEM fields, science and technology fields. And most of the strategies that are used from the external to the internal just simply don't work. So you have to begin to create an internal dynamic that causes more students to become interested in STEM fields. And that internal is possible through research, but research that in a sense has a direct tie to community in ways that are sustaining for both the individual and the community. So we have a lot of challenges, and we know those challenges. We have to continue, creating studies programs, indigenous institutions, continuing political fights of all kinds. But, we do have our extended families, our clans, our communities, and even the corporation can be sustainable. It's founded on principles of sustainability. I'm working with that one. I'm trying to work these ideas into the business guys, into the business field. And I'm starting to have some interesting invitations from business schools to come and talk about these kinds of principles, these ideas. So I think there's hope even there. So I just want to finish with this last slide. For me, these are the kind of the areas that I've looked at. I have done this presentation in a number of native places, native invitations. I did this particular presentation I did up in Seattle for the group called Erie, the Erie. So it was an eerie story. So, the list can be many. This is just my list. You project into that what you think. But it's really about reassembling and remembering, actually pulling back together again what indigenous people, what our ancestors used to do. Knowing and understanding we do live in a different context. We can't reinvent the past, but we certainly can use that understanding, in a sense, to not only work with our present issues, but also to ensure the future of our communities. Because ultimately, we are all kernels in the same basket. It comes back around to this idea. And that's why sustainability is a good container, is a good basket for, I think, a lot of our indigenous education, because we now can use these terms in our own ways, I think, to connect and to collaborate with many other people in the world that are doing the same kind of work, and even with scientists, who are very passionate about this kind of work. So I leave you with that thought, as you think about the work that you do and the kinds of things that you want to do, to really begin to consider that sustainability is really the purpose of indigenous education. And so how that happens and how we make that happen, I think, is up to us. So I thank you very much, wikundan, as we say in my language, for your kind attention. Thank you. If you have time, I will. Yeah. Yes.
When you're talking about the reversion to bring the Indigenous thought into the bubble of science, how do we maintain the authenticity and integrity of that traditional knowledge in that space?
Well, I think that really falls on the shoulders of the Indigenous researcher, Indigenous educator, or Indigenous entrepreneur, if you will, that is doing that kind of work within that discipline of science. You know, the curriculum that I wrote in Ignite the Sparkle, it was a high school curriculum, but it was really to create a student that could operate in both worlds simultaneously, who could be a good scientist, but yet at the same time really understand the nature of that, you know, authenticity in the context of the work that they are doing. And I've proved it. You know, if it can be done at the level of high school students, it can be done at the level of college students. That kind of bicultural teaching. The curriculum is not, the creation of curriculum is not the problem. The problem are the institutions themselves, are the disciplines themselves, and their unwillingness to, in a sense, accept, or in a willingness to, in a sense, create the space for Indigenous thought. So if you're an Indigenous scientist working in that space, largely speaking, at this point in time, you have to be the one that takes this on, you know, in ways that are appropriate. And it's hard work. I kid you not, it is hard work. But in doing that, and the more that's done, the more space that gets created for others to follow and to follow up on that. That's the other piece, is always following up, you know, finding ways to follow up. If the space is created, usually it's just this little tiny little hole, but then the next group gets it a little bit bigger, and it gets it a little bit bigger, and eventually you have that space to begin to work with. And that's what we're at. That's the place that we're at, and we're still at with sciences, is creating that bubble. But the biggest issue, the biggest challenge is that the status quo doesn't allow for that to happen. So we have to find ways to go around it and through it, to become viruses. Become a virus. It's called a meme. You become a meme, a virus that creates the host in their image. Yeah.
And that list of different forms of Indigenous knowledge, you had one that had revealed knowledge.
Yes.
Can you just talk a little bit more about that?
That's that vision. That's that vision piece. It's about you know, some tribes had, you know, formal ceremonies for vision quests. But I also want to, I like that question because I also want to emphasize that personal vision does matter too. And sometimes revealed knowledge is a result of personal vision and a personal experience that moves you to kind of a new level of thinking and understanding. So it's both the collective, you know, in terms of the vision quest, if you would will, but it's also the individual vision, you know, that revealed knowledge. So as you think about that, you know, that's what I'm referring to. Yeah.
I've got a question about the corporations that you work with. I suppose it's two questions. Are they Indigenous corporations?
Well, they're both. They're both. Some are what you would call green corporations, but they still, in others they do a lot of renewable energy and that type of work. But they're still working off the Western model of corporation. And so, but they're the ones that are beginning to be interested. Okay, well, what would an Indigenous corporation actually look like? What would be the principles that it would found and would move forward to? And so I think that there's a lot of hope you know, for doing that. I know that Monica is sitting in the back over there, because actually Monica has done a lot of this kind of work already here in the Maori context, you know. But I have to say that that hasn't really been happening in other parts of the world, other indigenous groups, other in the United States. You know, it's not as well known. So I think part of it is to find models and to disseminate them, you know, widely, especially in indigenous context, so that they see that it can work in some very basic ways. You know, it goes back to why I did that curriculum, integrating the Western science model with the. They are two different worldviews, and the indigenous mind. They're two different worldviews, and this is more the tendency. And what I was trying to get is what is called a bicultural or bilateral thinking process going on the part of students, so that they could see that there are areas where it can go like this. It doesn't always have to go like this. And so that's also conditioning too. You know, education is about conditioning for a certain kind of outcome, and that's what we have to begin to do. That's why I use the virus metaphor, because a virus actually physically, you know, conditions its host, you know, to do its bidding. Yeah.
Which actually was the second part of my question, which was more about choice, especially in today's world where more and more iwi within Aotearoa here
Yes.
have to conform to certain pieces of legislation.
Yes.
So I was thinking perhaps the choice, the pathways that we choose are lessened, but that they already.
Yeah. No, I don't think it should lessen the pathways. I think that this is where you have to begin to think creatively about how to use those opportunities in those contexts, you know, to reinvent. In a sense, the concept of corporation it actually comes from the word, you know, communication, communion, and community. You know, they're all related. Yes, so corporation is in there. It's a very special kind of expression, but it's coming from the same root word. It's about coming together to focus on something that's collective, you know, in terms of need or meaning.
Okay, please join me again in thanking Gregory.
Oh, yes, yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes.
So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes break while we set Karina up. You want to do the bottom break?
Oh, yes. Okay. I'm all tied up here. Can you?
As well.
Can you unput that?
Time travel isn't so hard. Yesterday, I talked with the children.
I worry about our accents. Oh. Okay. The kids talk kind of fast. I'm going to share some of their little stories.
Oh, lovely.
Oh, that's right. That's how you want it. You clip that onto your shirt, sure, and slide that into your pocket. Should work. There we go. You can't see with. Oh yeah. Try this. Right. Going on. Okay. Does that work?
Yep. And just so you can
All right.
see it's working out here, so that's good.
All right.
So I'll just grab here for you.
Okay.
Anything else?
Awesome.
Everything should just play from your computer straight onto the screen.
Okay.
I guess it just needs to wait until the recording finishes and then I'll check it out.
I'll remember for you too, Greg. I know I get nervous about
No, I'll remember.
leaving things.
Take it out.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got everyone breaks over. Typical, give Māori a break. Take a break. So now I want to turn to introduce another fantastic scholar. She's from the Choctaw Nation and is a professor in social work at the University of Washington. Both Gregory and Karina know the Aotearoa context reasonably well. They've been travelling here, visiting with us over a number of years, and Karina is currently on a major project with Cheryl Smith and Paul Reynolds, which is the historical trauma project funded by the Health Research Council, and I know Karina plays a really significant role in that project. So please welcome Professor Karina Walters.
Yes, okay. Halito, sa chifat hatapushi kan transpo activity ahoyo, yakoke chata mita chata hasia hoki, yakoke tainui waikato, and thank you everybody for being here. My name is Karina Walters. I introduced myself in my Choctaw name as well, and the short version is Butterfly Woman. And I also wanted to pay my respects to the Tainui and Waikato iwi of this land and say thank you for allowing me to speak in this way. I'm really excited to talk to you about a really uplifting topic called historical trauma. And after following from Greg's presentation, actually it's exciting because I get to talk a little bit about how I'm implementing some of these things and how there's a lot of synergy with our thoughts and our minds. So I'm really excited about that. I want to also pay respect to our tribal partners who are working on this project together, and especially Sandy Stroud and Michelle Johnson-Jennings, who I know made a tour already through this area. So for some of you who heard a little bit about them speaking about Yapali, the project I'm going to share with you, you'll hear a little bit more about what's happened since they've been here. I also want to just introduce my ancestors to you as well, just as I know it's important to understand and greet each other in that way. And yeah, so there they are. And our traditional homeland, our traditional lands are in Mississippi, the state of Mississippi, around Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. We claim New Orleans as well. But this is Nanawaya, this is our sacred mound. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that because one of the things that gets left out of the discussion when we talk about historical trauma and the impact on our wellness and our well-being is what doesn't always get talked about is the land and our relationship to the land. And after hearing our presentations, especially yesterday, it really became clear that I wanted to acknowledge that because one of the things I'll be talking about is how we were disrupted and ripped away from our land and removed and relocated, and the kind of impact that's had on us, but also how our well-being has thrived despite those kinds of things. So I want to start with two stories, maybe at least one story here. that kind of sets a context for this idea of historical trauma. Because our ancient stories, our ancient teachings, our original stories, our traditional knowledges, they actually, as Greg already has talked about, hold a lot of the keys and answers already, and actually provide us the metaphors by which to understand our living in contemporary lives and contemporary ways of being now. And so some of the experiences we've had and we struggle with that we call trauma are not unique, nor are they things that our people haven't already thought about. So I'm going to share with you a story about possum. And I know you guys have this complex relationship with possums. I know you guys hate them here. For us, they're a trickster figure in our stories. So for us, they hold some importance in our stories. So bear with me. But here's a story about possum. So maybe I'll give you a new view of possum. Long time ago, Possum lived with her children. One day, she was going about her business, and Big Bat came down and swooped down and grabbed all her children and took them off and carried them off and put them in a hole in some rocks on top of this mountain. Possum went around crying for her children. She said, "Oh no, something big came and stole my children away from me and put them somewhere where I can't get to them. Some hole in the rocks somewhere." Wolf heard her crying, and Wolf went up to her and said, "Possum, what's wrong? Why are you crying so much?" She said, "Oh, my children, this big thing came and swooped down and took them away and stored them away in this hole somewhere in the mountain there." And Wolf said, "Well, take me to the place. I can do it." Of course, Wolf would say that. So Wolf walked over and walked on in and walked to the place of the rocks, and he crawled in, and before you knew it, you heard him screaming, "Row!" And out he came, running out of the rocks. And he said, "I can't do it, I can't do it. It's just too scary." And he took off. And so Possum threw up her arms again, and she started crying and crying and crying. And sure enough, Chookfee, Rabbit, came walking. Rabbit said, "What's wrong, Possum? Why are you crying so?" And she said, "Because this big thing came and swooped down and stole my children and put them in some rocks somewhere." And the Rabbit, of course, said, "Oh, I could do that. I can go get your children back for you." So Rabbit went hopping on in and hopped into that hole, and before you knew it, you heard, "Ah!" And now came Rabbit, running back out and said, "I can't do it. That is just too scary. I can't do it." And Possum started crying again, and she's crying and crying. Finally, Highland Terrapin, or Highland Turtle, comes walking up and says, "Possum, what's going on? Why are you crying?" She said, "Some big thing came and stole my children and took them away to this strange structure over there, and now they're over there and I can't get them." And Highland Terrapin looked at her and said, "Lead me to it." So Highland Terrapin went over, and Turtle took a look into the rocks and crawled in, and you heard a "Wah!" But Turtle didn't come out. Turtle kept going. Turtle actually had to go over some ashes and got burned along the way. But nevertheless, he went and he saw those baby opossum, and he threw them onto his back, and he came crawling back out of the hole, and he came crawling back over, and he delivered the children back to Possum. And what he did after that is he looked at Possum, and he looked at her navel, and he cut a line across her navel, and he put her children into her pouch. And he said, from now on, he said, "Remember, you always keep your children close to you. You always don't let them go until you're finished suckling them. They must be suckled first before you can let them go and release them." And so that's how Possum got her babies back. Okay. So I'm going to talk about boarding school a little bit later. So let's think about that. The second story is Naholo. Now, we have water serpents, like I know you have spirits, guardians of the waters and things like that. But Naholo is not actually a good one. Naholo, interestingly, is the name that we gave the white people when they came to our land. And the anthropologists really got this confused. The anthropologists heard that it was a god, and so they wrote down, the Naholo were seen as white gods that descended upon the Choctaws, and they looked at them with reverence. And I'm like, oh my goodness, those poor anthropologists. And so they really had it wrong. What they heard was that we said it was it is a high-ranking spirit in the spirit world, but it's a very dangerous one. And so what Naholo does is Naholo lives in the water, and Naholo is white. white, and it's like a white silvery serpent, water serpent, and lives near whirlpools. We talk about it being near whirlpools. But naholo can actually call you, and it calls you and has a beautiful call, and it's very attractive, it's very alluring, and it draws you near to the water, and it draws you in to gaze at your own reflection. And as you're gazing at your own reflection and admiring yourself, naholo jumps up and will take you into that water and make you and transform you into a naholo as well. That's how naholos survive, and that's how they reproduce. That was an ancient story we have about naholo. I think our ancestors were really insightful. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit, and you'll see as we talk, I'm going to talk about internalized oppression, and also that's how this could be a metaphor for internalized oppression. And I know Greg says it's important to go really in depth in this, and we do with our communities, but I'm giving you a little bit of the comic book version of that right now. One of the things that really guide our research is, kind of trying to understand how do traumatic stressors and events in our lives impact our wellness, and how do we literally take it up in our bodies, and how do we express it in behaviors that sometimes are helpful and sometimes not helpful for us. So that's been kind of the heart of the work that I've been doing. There's a big giant embodiment debate in the research world, which is, historically traumatic events might not really matter if you really consider the lifetime traumatic events that our communities are already enduring. Maybe those are just really the most salient, and we don't have to worry about historical trauma, these events that happened in previous generations. And one of the reasons I got inspired to do this is because our own communities have a discourse about the importance of understanding intergenerational transmission of these traumas, that things can carry on and manifest itself if you don't heal it, if you don't take care of it. It comes up in next generations. And I want to put a caveat out there. Just because our communities have experienced something like that doesn't mean everybody has these negative things that arise, but that our communities do have a discussion about it. I think that's a reasonable empirical question, but the reality is, there's even cellular evidence that's starting to show that there is actually evidence of intergenerational transmission over time. Not that we need that to validate our claims, because we already know that our discourse is really critical. But I think it's interesting from cell to our culture that people are beginning to have these conversations and talk about it. And I think that's partly because our science in general, when I say science I mean Western science as well as indigenous science, Western science is finally kind of getting it right in terms of moving from the absence of disease model to a much more holistic approach. You see it in psychoneuroimmunology, really looking at the mind-body, place even connection to wellness. And that's basically what our communities understand is our worldview, and that Greg talked about a little bit earlier. It makes it hard for us to do this kind of research, though, in the research world because so many of our measures and models are based on the absence of disease. It's not on the presence of wellness, right? So if we use measures that currently exist, it's about not having depression. It's not about having wellness. And what does that really look like? So that's part of our challenge in doing the work that we're doing. So let's talk a little bit about historical trauma just to set the context before I jump into Yapali, so we're on the same wavelength on this. When I'm talking about historical trauma, I'm not talking about a weather event that happens on a people. That's a massive cataclysmic event that impacts the whole community. That's true. But historical trauma is unique in the sense that these are traumatic events that are manufactured and delivered by human beings to purposefully either commit genocide or ethnocide. Genocide, literally the destruction of people. Ethnocide is a form of genocide, which is the systematic destruction of culture and lifeways. There is a targeted approach to eradicate culture and people. And by virtue of killing culture, you're killing people, right? Our communities talk about these events aren't in isolation. You don't have one single event when you think about historically traumatic events in your lifetime. Usually communities are targeted, so you have several. And quite often these are sustained and collective in nature. And so this is the reason why we talk about how some of the impact of these events can be transmitted over generations. Okay. These events can consist of catastrophic upheaval, usually high levels of community distress that happens with these events. Quite often they could be events like planned government phenomenon, like being forced into residential schools or boarding schools. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, especially for kids and the impact on children. Environmental trauma, radioactive dumping on traditional lands would be considered a form of historical trauma, or spiritual, not being able to practice your spiritual practices or your religion, similar to I think you had the Tohunga Act here. We had the Court of Indian Offenses in the 1880s that outlawed our ability to practice our religions. It wasn't until the 1970s and even into the 1990s did some of those laws get partially turned around, not 100%. Historical trauma is confusing when you read about it in the literature because people talk about it all kinds of different ways. They use this phrase and they sometimes mean it as an event that causes a bad outcome, and sometimes they mean it as the outcome itself, like you have a historical trauma response, right? And then other times people talk about it as a mechanism or a pathway. How does it get transmitted over generations? And then you see a lot of work in the literature on historical trauma loss, the losses that have been experienced, like the loss of knowledge, loss of language, and this whole kind of loss process. So that's kind of another way it's talked about. So it makes it hard to have coherence in the work that even across Indian country and Native researchers that are doing this, we don't necessarily have a lot of coherence about how we approach this. So I just want to put that out there. Am I talking too fast? Am you guys okay? Okay. In terms of the impact on children, because we wanted a little bit of a focus on that, just a couple of points just to highlight. One of the things that, from the Holocaust literature that they found that was interesting, that I think is interesting for Native people, is that there was an assumption that if you took Holocaust survivors and compared them to non-Holocaust survivors who are also Jewish, that you would see a lot of differences in terms of mental health. And actually what they found out that there wasn't as many differences as they anticipated. Actually there weren't much at all. And if you take the offspring and the grandchildren of those, there really is no difference. And they were kind of surprised until they did longitudinal research to follow over time. And what they found is that the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, if there was a traumatic event or major stressor, were much more likely to have post-traumatic stress disorder or other kinds of stressor symptoms that would arise compared to ones who had not been exposed. So that suggests that there may be something that's still carrying on through some of the generations. Some of the research on Holocaust survivors as well and families, I just wanted to highlight, and this is just some of the earlier work. What happens when people have had major trauma? They don't tend to talk about it, right? And one of the things that people do is they avoid it. They avoid talking about it. You think about your grandparents. They don't want to talk about it, right? Even when we do this work in our community, we have to do a lot of readiness work to see if people are ready to talk about it, because not everyone wants to talk about it, right? It drags up these memories and issues. You don't want to traumatize your elders. I mean, there's a lot of issues that have to be explored before approaching a topic like this in the communities. But what's interesting is the research has shown that the more profound the silence, the impact on the children and grandchildren is greater. In part because they fill in with their imagination stories that might be even more horrendous than actually what happened in their whānau. So talking about it actually matters, but how you talk about it matters too. You don't want to carry the trauma. You don't want to grow the trauma. You don't want to nurture the spirit of the trauma. You really want to nurture the spirit of healing. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. Some of the themes when we talk to our communities about creating a measure of trauma, I mean, part of this was there was no measures of historical trauma, so we had to create a measure to do the big projects that we were doing. And genocide, of course, was some of the major themes. And this just gives you a couple of visual examples of our history of genocide. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but massacres are a good example of that. Really important for our people in terms of Choctaw and contextualizing Choctaw trauma, our land allotments. When our lands were stolen from us, really, literally. This was like timber barons coming in who, through the Dawes Commission, to get our lands. When we were relocated in 1830, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later, we were settled in a place called Indian Territory, which is now known as the state of Oklahoma. Oklahoma, by the way, is a Choctaw word. It means red people. We were told we could live there as long as the rivers flow and the flowers bloom, and everything will be fine. That'll be our territory, our Indian land. And of course, that's not true. So in the 1880s, right around that time, more Western expansion was happening, and people wanted our land again. And so the Dawes Commission came in, and these were timber guys who had a direct conflict of interest to portioning these lands, and literally, in my estimation, I'm going to say it was stolen from us. I have to be careful because there's some people who would question that logic, but that is my interpretation. And these are some of the examples of the environmental and spiritual traumas. So this is the one thing I want to highlight about historical trauma. These are the buffalo skulls. General Sheridan said the best way to kill the Lakota was to kill the buffalo. And he was clever in the sense that this wasn't about interrupting people's sustainability for food, but it was about interrupting a people's ability to fulfill their original instructions. And I want to highlight that that's a hallmark of historical trauma. Historically traumatic events are designed to interrupt people's ability to fulfill their original instructions as to who they are as a people. And that's the reason why I think when Greg's talking about how healing happens and sustainability happens is through those ancient teachings. And I'm saying this is one of the artifacts of historical trauma, is to try to disrupt us from those original teachings. The boarding school is a period for us is one of the great examples of that. In the 1880s, several things happened. A law, I think it was the Lone Wolf decision, and Greg might know if he remembers, made us almost fully human. So three events happened when we became almost fully human. We became potentially educatable. So the boarding schools were started as another way to kill the Indian to save the man. The other thing that happened is the first Indian Insane Asylum was developed, the Canton, it was called Hiawatha Insane Asylum in Canton, South Dakota. So we became human enough to have a mental illness. And the third thing was the Court of Indian Offenses. So if you were found practicing your cultural practices, your food rations could be withheld, or you could be imprisoned for up to 6 months. So these were major events that co-occurred during this time. Now think about it, 1880s to 1930s, 40s, not long ago. Not long ago. Children were forced to be removed. Now this was a real interesting policy. Before then there were mission day schools in some communities, so I want to acknowledge that. But what was different about this policy was there was a purposeful intention to remove children far away from home, send them as far away, and keep them separated from their family for up to, on average, 7 years. 7 years, at critical life moments, to be raised by an institution, a militaristic one at that, by a superintendent that used to be in charge of prisoners of war at Fort Marion Prison in Florida, and he was head of Indian education. And they were not allowed to practice the language, and certainly you can imagine in that environment, you don't learn traditional knowledges, you don't learn traditional parenting, you don't learn traditional ways of relating to each other. So this is the other piece about colonization and historical trauma. Not only does it disrupt your ability to fulfill your original instructions, it disrupts your relational ways of being. Your relationship to each other, to your community, to your bodies, right? Even down to your bodies, because there's so much sexual abuse and physical trauma that a lot of people endure in those schools. So this is a picture of Carlisle Indian School. This was a famous first massive one. And look, you see how young these children are. And they were sent off, during the summers, they would be sent off to be indentured servants, the nice word, to work in wealthy white families' homes in New Jersey and Pennsylvania and New York City as maids or servants. This is a group of young men who arrived at Carlisle, and this is what they look like after being there for a while. This is a young Navajo man, Tom Torino, years later. Patriarchy. So the other piece is the explicit introduction of Christianity, or certain forms of Christianity, I should, as a caveat, into our communities as well. So some communities that were matrilineal and matriarchal, mine, for example, our tribe was historically matrilineal and matriarchal. If there was a problem with your husband, you just took his clothes and you put it out the door, and he had to go back and move back in with mom. That was that simple. Yeah, we controlled the agriculture. Look at all these ladies are like, oh, I like this. Yeah, I mean, we controlled the agriculture. We were in charge. Even though the men worked the fields, we were the ones who held the economy. And so, very different now. Very different now, because what they did was they really tried to reestablish all of that. There's a group of Choctaw men from Armstrong Academy, from our tribe, in 1905 to 1909. You can see the range of our looks too. So here's the bottom line: the impact of historical trauma causes a disruption in your ability to fulfill your original instructions, your disruption in relational ways of being, which to me is at the core of not only being Indigenous but being human. Disruption in our spatial obligations and relationships. So an example of that in this moment is how we think and understand and perceive ourselves and experience ourselves in the world. In this moment, I am my granddaughter's ancestor. In this moment, I am my grandmother's granddaughter. In this moment, I'm all of these things. So any action I take in this moment has ramifications across space and time. From a clinical perspective, because I used to be a psychotherapist way back when, it's a great opportunity to work with clients who are really struggling and say, wow, you are in an incredible opportunity right now to heal. And in our communities, we don't always heal for ourselves, but if we start talking about, gee, if you take action right now, you have an opportunity not only to make a difference for yourself, but you're going to make a difference for those who didn't get that opportunity that you still carry with you, and then those who are coming in 7, 8, 9, 10 generations ahead. What an incredibly powerful place to be when our people are feeling really disempowered. So reconnecting to those ways of thinking are really critical to understanding ourselves. So a lot of these traumatic events sometimes could cause those kinds of disruptions. And then literally breaking down, when you're getting sexually and physically abused in these schools, it's going to break down your physical, mental sense of boundaries, body boundaries, and other kinds of things. And the final thing, which I think is really critical, is colonization requires dependency for it to be maintained. And colonization is designed for us to try to become dependent on it. And so part of disrupting colonization and these practices and decolonizing is to interrupt systems of dependency in ways we might not even be aware of. So a good example is in clinical health settings, people who've been socialized to be clients for a really long time. They begin to talk about themselves as if they're the disease, right? I'm diabetic. I'm alcoholic, right? And the problem with that, there's a lot of problems with that, but one of the major problems with that from an Indigenous perspective is it denies the relational way of being. So, you know, no one says it with other, you know, it's interesting, and it's always just these disorders that disproportionately affect our communities, that we become it. But if you have cancer, you don't say, I'm cancer, right? Unless that's your zodiac sign, right? You say, I'm living with cancer. I have a relationship with this cancer. So what happens is when you have a relationship with something, you can decide when it leaves, when it comes, when it goes, when you want it to visit. So if a person says, I'm depressed, you say, well, tell me about your relationship with depression. You have a relationship with it. Then it's something that isn't a forever state of being. It's about an opportunity to have shift your relationship and create new boundaries, new ways of relating. I don't like that you visit depression at 3 a.m. in the morning and wake me up. Early morning awakening, for those who are clinical. So you get an opportunity to shift that. So this is what we do in a lot of our intervention approaches in our community level, is we do 3 major elements. We say we have to grow our interventions from our ancient teachings whenever possible and wherever possible. That's always where we start. And even if we're struggling, we will find a way to find that story. And like good cheat sheets are, for example, you know, in some communities, I work a lot in urban communities, and a lot of urban communities are like, I have no idea about my stories or my histories or anything. Sometimes, like when I do some work now in diabetes and obesity, and that's hence the Opoli project, we pull off the calendars off the wall of their traditional calendars, and we start with the traditional words for the month. And not the modern ones, not like in my tribe will say July for July. No, that's not our traditional language. The old language, which then says, oh, this is Little Hunger Month, this is Big Hunger Month, this is the month we pick these berries. And then all of a sudden you're getting back to the relational way of being with the land and your environment and the protocols for living. So the relational way of being is really about invoking the protocols for living healthfully. And I think that's connecting to Greg's work on sustainability. So the three areas: original instructions, relational restoration, finding ways to relationally restore things, even your orientation to the world, and narrative transformation. How we talk and think about ourselves really does matter. Words do have power. And so that's the three elements that we talk about in dealing with historical trauma. Just going to summarize a couple of the findings from other studies, and this is from Honor Project study, 452 survey interviews, just to give you an idea of some of the findings that support the work. We asked people, have they experienced historical trauma, have their grandparents, their great-grandparents. We asked by specific events: boarding school, sterilization, medical experimentation, things like that. And we also did something, because we knew the critics would say, it's a lifetime trauma that's really going to drive the findings here, not the historical trauma. But we wanted to see, is there an effect over time for people's current wellness that can be tied to or associated with these previous events? So what we did was we controlled for, statistically, lifetime trauma that a person's experienced, military combat exposure, which would likely cause trauma responses for a lot of folks. We controlled for lifetime assaults that people have experienced, both sexual and physical, both in childhood and adulthood. We even controlled for people who've experienced their own historically traumatic events and took those events out of the equation and said, does your ancestors' historically traumatic events affect your current symptoms of depression or post-traumatic stress disorder? And what we found is it does. It still holds. But what was interesting was the type of event mattered. So disruptions in relational ways of being with family, ties to family, or community, or land, actually was related to depressive symptoms. And direct attacks on person, land, or place was related to more PTSD symptoms. So there's something, and for those of you who work direct clinical work in your communities, counseling, anything like that, that's important to know that the type of event, the disruption versus a direct attack, it's these indirect impacts that can cause more depressive symptoms possibly. So we're still running analyses on this, but just wanted to give you kind of the heads up on it. Then we also found that chronicity of events over time matters. The more events your ancestor experienced, the more likely you have an impact now. This is in terms of alcohol use. And then for our relatives from yesterday, I threw this slide in last second because loss of land was a major factor for people. If you lose your land, it does have an impact on contemporary health, both physical and mental health. And even we thought maybe land neglect, but that didn't quite work out. And then we see it even in terms of current behaviors. People who think a lot about these historically traumatic losses were 3.5 times the odds of having current smoking. So we're seeing some role there. But here's the good news. The good news is that what makes a difference is the culturally protective factors. So not everyone does poorly, right? I'm just giving you kind of the example of how these events can have negative health impacts. But the good news is that if you have a strong identity and you're strong in who you are, that acts as a protective factor that buffers the impact of those events on your wellness outcomes. And so we actually found that with discrimination. We looked at everyday discrimination that people experienced as well, not just historical trauma. And when we looked at his everyday discriminatory events, a good example, like someone asked me once to come dressed as an Indian to teach a lecture. Well, you're like, oh my God. those kind of events. I do a whole bunch of other research in microaggressions, but those kind of events, those get really tiring and exhausting, and you know, if we pay too much attention, we lose our mind by the end of the day. So we figure out a way to cope with them. But what we found is that people who are strong in their identity and feel good about who they are as an Indigenous person, those events kind of run off you. It's like water on a duck's back. But if you don't feel strong in your identity, that's when it acts as a conduit. And that actually was a factor in poor self-rated health. So that identity matters, and identity is a major factor. And we kind of know that, but it's you know, I'm a geek and I like finding these things in research. So turning to Yawpali, so one of the things that, you know, because I've done a lot of work in this area, I had the opportunity to work with my own tribe, and it's truly a gift to be able to, it's actually a privilege for me. You know, I've done all this work all over the country, and I hadn't had the opportunity yet to give back to my own relatives. And the opportunity came a couple of years ago, and the director of our health program, and we're the third largest tribe in the United States. Our tribal jurisdiction lands are in southeastern Oklahoma. It's the size of the state of New Hampshire. It's the size of one of our states. So it's a big area. It covers 10.5 districts. So we're counties. we're pretty big. Roughly about 200,000 Choctaws. Not all living there, though. About half live all over. We have a diaspora. But I had the opportunity because Mickey Piercy had asked me, and he said, you know, we're in a time where we've spent millions of dollars on trying to deal with diabetes and obesity, and we've made a dent, but the train is moving still too fast, and it's still out of control. What can we do? And I said, well, what do you mean? And they took me on a tour of all of the clinics that we have now, and it's amazing. We have our own incredible economic infrastructure. We have our own hospital, not Indian Health Service funded, not government funded. It's through our own enterprises. We have, in every district, we have our own gym, like a beautiful physical fitness facility. I mean, I'm talking amazing. We have medical services that are incredible at all of our sites. We actually have a diabetes whole center that's a beautiful diabetes center, and we're not seeing any change. And he said, I said, well, how bad is it? I mean, I kind of knew it was bad, but it wasn't until he sat and he said, well, we're in a generation where by 2050, 1 out of 3 of our kids are going to have type 2 diabetes. And I was like, are you kidding me? And he's like, no, I'm serious. 1 out of 3, that's the projections. 70% of our people right now are obese or overweight, seriously overweight. And he said, this is what finally got me, is he said, he goes, listen, we're in a generation where parents are going to outlive their grandchildren. And I thought, whoa, okay. And he said, and then what? I said, well, what have you done? He goes, well, we have state-of-the-art clinics. We're putting in roads. We're putting in walking paths. We've changed the menus at all our tribal functions. We're trying to change the culture of this, that, and the other, but still to no avail. We're not moving fast enough. Things aren't, you know, and frankly, our community's not taking it up. And I said, well, what do you think's happening? And he said, I think there's an incredible sadness that we haven't dealt with. And we just need to have another approach to this. So can you help us? And I was like, oh, no. I felt completely I was like, no. I was like, well, you're doing all the empirical things right, because they took all the Western models and they applied it. And they've done them right. But still not seeing a change. Or they're seeing some change. I want to give some credit, but not at the rate that they needed. And so I went away, and my response was not to go to the Lit Review and not to go figure this out, because I kind of know the Lit Review. I actually went and prayed. And I told him, I said, I need to go pray. Because I knew the answer wasn't going to come through. Since they've been trying all the modern methods, I thought, okay, maybe something else will come of it. And actually what came of it is when I walked away, I started thinking about it. And what really hit me was that our ancestors did not die rewalking this trail, and I was going to talk about that trail in a second, so that we would be in the conditions we're in today. And that they held a vision for us, and that we had to somehow get connect to that vision. The other thing I realized that we do really well is we've learned to create all of our health and well-being processes through services. Way too much way too much dependency on services. That what we needed to do was develop an approach, because all the examples he gave me were all services. I didn't hear anything about sustainability at the community level, about really community change and community love to do this. It was all about services. And I thought, well, there's the problem. We know really well what not to do, right? Don't eat too much, don't drink too much, you know. And we've done a great job of saying what to do, moderate food and exercise a little bit. What we failed to do is to remind, why do we exist as Choctaw? That's the glue. Why are we here? Why do we exist? And that's the place where the motivation for change for our communities really, truly come. We all know, if you take a vitamin, we know these things. It's this other element that needs to be in place. The other piece was, it kind of begged for not this deficit. We already have too much deficit model focus, right? And so one of the things we started thinking, well, how do we create a health promotion model from our perspective that really guides the work that needs to happen? And so we started thinking, okay, and so I went and I talked with our chief sister, Sharon Fleming, who I have to give a lot of credit for, because this project couldn't have happened without her putting it through. She really went to bat for it because she had a vision of actually rewalking the trail at some point. So this was super synergistic coming together at the time that she wanted to do something as well. And Michelle Johnson Jennings, she was there also at the beginning when we first had these conversations. And so, we started thinking about it, and we said, well, this gives us the opportunity to rethink it and not do something that's about substance abuse prevention, but to start saying, well, what were our original instructions for medicines? Instead of suicide prevention, what are our original instructions for living and how to live? Our value for living. What does that mean? Instead of mental health or psychopathology prevention, how do we live in balance? And when we get out of balance, how do we right ourselves? We have ways of doing that. And it's not to, say nay to services. Services are good for when there's an emergency, you need to get through it. But what about that sustainability piece? So that's how that project got started. And we started putting our heads together. So in 1830s, and just to give you an idea, in 1830, the federal government decided to remove all the Indians living west of the Mississippi, east of the Mississippi west. They tried all, they didn't get all, but we were the first to be removed. So the Cherokees kind of get all the credit for this, calling it the Trail of Tears. It's actually our chief that said it was the long trail, the long sad march of tears. Anyways, but you know how those tribal things go. It was us first. But that red line there, you see Choctaw 1830, and we had to walk. Our clans and all our clans and towns in those areas had to walk at least 500 miles even to get to the start points to be relocated and across. Now, the thing to keep in mind, this was under serious duress. The Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek is the treaty that got us the agreement to remove. But the issue was, our grandmothers came together and said, no, we are not removing. And then a group left. And then they ended up staying, and for 2 days, if you saw the bar bill, it was over $2,000 for that group that ended up being there. And then also there's talks about guns and rifles and things being forced to sign this treaty. But the issue is that we kind of grew up with this idea that we abandoned our relatives back home, because there is a group of Choctaws that stayed and ran to the hills, and we now have the Mississippi Choctaws that are still there. And those who went away we always kind of had this, oh, that's our homeland, what did we do? Did we sell out by leaving? But what was really amazing about this project, it got us to really look at the actual archival records and really get to the stories behind this. And what we actually found out was that not only did we fight against removing, what ended up happening was when we were given the choice to stay, and the choice, I want to put in big quotes, because the people who did stay behind actually were horribly, horribly abused and treated. But when we were given the choice to stay, the choice was, you give up your right to be Choctaw, and you can stay as a citizen of Mississippi. And you can even possibly keep your lands, which was not true. You weren't allowed to do that. But you can now become a citizen of the United States in the state of Mississippi. And Harkins, one of our chiefs, we didn't, by the way, at that time we didn't have one chief. We had several chiefs of the different districts, and Chief Harkins said, "We were hedged in by two evils, and we chose that which we thought the least. We as Choctaws rather choose to suffer and be free than live under the degrading influence of laws, which our voice could not be heard in their formation. I could cheerfully hope that those Choctaws of another age and generation may not feel the effects of those oppressive measures that have been so illiberally dealt out to us, and that peace and happiness may be their reward. Amid the gloom and horrors of the present separation, we are cheered with the hope that ere long we shall reach our destined land, and that nothing short of the basest acts of treachery will ever be able to wrest it from us, and that we may live free. Although your ancestors won freedom on the field of danger and glory, our ancestors owned it as their birthright, and we have had to purchase it from you as the vilest slaves by their freedom." He basically said, we'd rather die than go. And that helped us reframe our whole project. That this wasn't about, so what happens, we went back to the tribe and we said, okay, we have the idea. We want to rewalk the Trail of Tears. They're like, okay. That's an interesting way to deal with obesity. But we said it's deeper than that. And they're like, and then the grandparents, you could tell them getting a little nervous. Why do you want to do all that trauma and that drama? And they're like, no, it's not about the trauma and the drama. We're not rewalking the trail to get all, we're not memorializing it. This is not a memorial walk. We're rewalking the trail to get in touch with the vision of love that our ancestors held for us so that we could live. And that we create our interventions in our community, our sustainable interventions from that vision of love, and better yet, that we vow make to do the same for the future generations. That this is a vow-making process to begin to reconnect with that vision. So the first walk was just to reconnect to the vision, and then subsequent walk, which we just did, was to begin to think about what are our responsibilities now to carry that forward. So, do I have a few more minutes? I'm almost done. How are we doing? We okay? So the initial focus was understanding our ancestral vision and their intentions for our health and wellness. So when they walked that trail, because they knew that they were going to, some of them were going to die, they still had a vision of living for us. And so we have a responsibility to that vision. So we were trying to understand what was their vision for us. And then we wanted to translate these visions into health promotion practices for our people. What can we do? Basically regenerating, regrowing our traditional understandings of health and wellness and transforming our relationships to health. Bringing in our original instructions and moving one from that disease perspective and service orientation to one of sustainability in the communities and one of wellness. And then transforming the relationship to trauma itself, to the trail itself. That it actually became really clear, and it was funny because some of the male elders in our tribe were kind of excited that women were heading this project. Because we started hearing traditional stories. As we did this, the stories came out. And then we started hearing, well, you know, women are traditionally responsible ceremonially in the old days to restore the balance. So when a great wrong happened, we were responsible for that ceremonial restoration or restitution. On the extreme end of things, during times of war, we tortured the prisoners. We're in charge of torturing prisoners. I'm serious. But that was, again, about restoration. I just thought I'd throw that out there, just to see if you're still listening. Okay. But when there's a great dis-ease, literally dis-ease, out of balance, we were the ones who were responsible for restoring that balance. So they were actually really excited that women were doing this. And they actually gave us instructions for how to approach the trail, how to take care of it, and also to recognize that other people have gone through and cleaned it. So we don't have this big burden, but rather begin to make sure we're moving forward. Naming, critically important. We didn't have a name, so we went to our elders and we started talking. Now this is really interesting. You know, when you do research projects in our communities, how many of you go to like language departments? Do you guys do that? A lot of our tribes start to do that. We have language departments in our tribes. It's good and it's bad. What ended up happening was we went to some elders, and Sandy actually went to her mom and talked to her mom about it. And after a while, and Sandy looked through books, and we found an old word. And Yapali is actually a word that's not in use anymore. And so that became a bit of a controversy because our language department decided that's not a real word. And we're like, but it's an ancient word, and we just don't use it anymore. We'd like to use it again since we're trying to reconnect to ancient things. So we had a bit of a go around on it. But when we got the blessing from the elder, said, yeah, go ahead, use that word. And so we did. So the word means to walk slowly and softly with reverence. And we thought that's the approach as researchers we need to take to this. That we need to walk slowly and softly with respect for all things. Our relatives, the land, our current relatives, our ancestral life, recognizing that there's a blessing in that process to walk the sacred grounds of our ancestors' sacrifice. And our vision to create a better, healthier life for our children, and reclaiming our history, our healthy ways as a people, and our medicine, including our spiritual medicines. So, yeah. So what we did, and for those of you who are on the methods end of things and interested on the research side of it, we approached this as Choctaw women first, then came, kind of like, oh yeah, that's right, we wanted to do research. And one of the things that we decided is we'll start with qualitative work on this. And we were both researchers and participants. And so what we're trying to do is trying to articulate some of the methods, and that's actually an approach. And a lot of our communities do it. But we're really trying to struggle with the ethics around that and how to create the ethics in a really beautiful way. Not struggling in a bad way, but start just learning to articulate it. We actually did geo-mapping because the trail isn't known. Parts of it are known. There's the highway version known, which is the approximate trail. We don't want the approximate trail, even if it goes, under the city hall. We want to know if that's our trail. So we wanted to get as exact as we could. We did a major archival research looking at old historical records. Let me tell you, you got to get your big girl pants on for that because it was really upsetting to read the direct first-hand accounts from the military people and a lot of things. It was actually more disturbing than we had. So we had to do ceremony through all that process too. We did blogging. We decided that this isn't just our story or our experience, but that as we told people about what we were doing in other tribes, they got inspired. And we realized they were being transformed. So we thought it was important to also blog so that people could decide whether or not they want to go on the trail with us. And they can actually geotag on the trail with us on site, so it was kind of cool. So we were learning how to do that. That was well beyond my abilities, but the folks I work with were doing that. We held focus groups on the trail itself. Would not recommend that again. But that was a good experiment. It's like being in ceremony and all of a sudden, oh, let's have a focus group. It did not work. It wasn't quite that bad, but we were just exhausted and really couldn't even articulate. And we had this grand idea to journal and oh yeah, we'll journal. We'll all journal. But I would now take a tape recorder now if I could and just say, just talk and walk. We did interviews. We did pre and post interviews. We want to know what people's experiences were before they hit the trail and what they imagined it to be, and then what their experiences were when they came off the trail. And that was really neat. And our doctoral students are analyzing that right now. Katie Schultz just finished a paper on that. We also did digital storytelling. So one of the things that we did is we wanted people to come away from the trail with their own story to be able to share with the community. And last year what we did is after we gathered all our, there was a whole process and talking circle method that we did with the digital, creating those stories. Children went with us on this first round. You had to be over a certain weight and age because of potential encounters with rattlesnakes and poisonous things. So we had to, yes, that was part of our IRB. It was quite an exciting thing. But what we did was we actually gave it back to the community. So we had them go into the communities with all the community health reps at the end of this first phase and share the stories. And so we had community meetings to share the stories and share food and talk about it and get community feedback. It was 10 days on the trail that we planned to walk. We walked across Arkansas. We identified the campgrounds where our clan stayed, and that's where we camped. Unfortunately, that in some cases were the wildlife refuges. And during the heat of the summer, we were fresh material for the bugs. and we just got eaten alive. It was really rough. But our elders actually told us to walk it in June, and Greg laughed when I told him because he knows like what that's like. It's very swampy, very, very hot. It was over 100 degrees every day. And I think they wanted us to have our own little mini trail of tears. And we did. I can honestly say all of us shed tears on that trail. But what we try to do is walk the goal. Our goal was to walk the same amount of miles that our ancestors would have walked on average each day. So we walked anywhere from 8 to 12 miles a day. And then we would drive on the intact parts of the trails that we could find, and the trails that were still dirt as much as possible. And the other places, then we would go set up at the actual campsites where we stayed. Before that, we talked about the values that we wanted to underpin our project to even get started, like what are our shared values. We met with elders, and Sandy's mom helped us with this, and we came up with these were some of the values that we wanted to have to start with. And then I wanted to just point out the tribal, our language department said, oh, if you want the word listen is haklo. And we're like, okay, that sounds nice and okay. But then we took it one step further. We took it back to a primary language speaker, an elder, and then we said, what does haklo really mean? And then this is the things that she talked about what haklo means. So you get much deeper meaning when you really go back. So you don't want to take the first look at it. You really go back. And for her, haklo is to remember that the medicine given to us is still out there. I mean, that's like a whole other level of listen, right? We have just forgotten to listen for it. So we had 13 Choctaw walkers. We had 5 Native allies. That was purposeful. We wanted our Native allies to come with us to bear witness. We thought the witnessing would be important. We had doctoral students come with us as well. We had 4 parent-youth pairs. We wanted to see potentially, since we had whānau that walked, what it's going to be like to actually bring your kids, and can we create an intervention that would incorporate kids in the future. What was unique about this, not really unique to being Indigenous people. We had met with elders before we left and ensured we had certain ceremonies in place before we left and while we were on the trail. IRB was a challenge at not at the university, but at the tribe. They kept insisting that we had to account for chiggers. These are bugs that bury into your hair follicle and suck your blood. And things like that, and they were right. Some of the initial reflections is the incredible power of us coming together, the potential for children and youth thinking about this in the future, that this could be a rite of passage. We've lost a lot of our rites of passages, and in a way we saw it as a rite of passage. We naturally created our own ixas, or our clans on the trail, and it was interesting how that happened. And literally, it started happening. People gathered together by clan, even though they didn't know it. It just happened. It was very interesting. There's a Trail of Tears song that was sung for us when we originally left, and then that we carried with us on the trail. Just to give you a line of it, it's like, Ina ushi pisali bakchito onali ya yali ya yali. What that means is we got to the big river, the Mississippi, and our people, we got there and we crossed it, and we walked and we cried and we cried. So that was our song. So we thought it would be nice, can we have other parts of the song arise now in new generation? And the last 3 days of the walk, the next 3 lines came, and it got added. So there's more to that song now. We started with naming nicknames this round. This last time we went, we actually did naming ceremonies. So it's growing as we've gone our second time. Last thing I want to say, because I know I'm running out of time, is that the relational healing was critical. The transformative power of laughter was immeasurable. What we realized is you can't sustain grief for 10 days like that. And we actually had to remind people that that's not our purpose, is to dwell in the grief. To feel it, name it, experience it, but then also allow the joy that is also present to be there. And we had a very stunning experience at Village Creek State Park. After been walking 100 degrees with horrible in the prairie, with sun just beating on us and having a really hard day, we got to the Village Creek where there's a forest. And the Choctaws, we tend to be a little irreverent sometimes. We're known for that. We like started laughing and whooping it up, and we were so excited. And all of our native allies were like, "Look at the land here! You could see how deep the ground is, where people traveled. Thousands of people were like, this is great," because we experienced the joy. All of a sudden we realized our ancestors also had joy, had moments of joy, and we were able to connect with that. And that was actually really important for us because it got rid of the. It made historical trauma less scary, right? So it was actually really helpful. And the final thing is Shalom Bush and peace. This would not have happened if we didn't have this talk. I was a therapist. Michelle Johnson-Jennings is a clinical therapist. Both of us were sitting around talking. We've done therapy in our communities for a long time. And then all of a sudden, out of this project, we're sitting around talking and going, hey, do you remember when your mom used to... Did your mom used to like embarrass you, like yell your name loud and and all that? And we're like, yeah, and it's because you're Shalombush, right? And you're like, yeah. So we believe that you have your Shillip and your Shalombush. Your Shillip is your shell, your body, that spirit. It's a spirit that helps you feed yourself, gets you dressed. Maintenance, your maintenance spirit. Your Shalombush is that energy, that life force, that one that gives you who you are, that beauty, but it's excitable. It loves to get excited. So what the worry was, if you get into out on a playground and you get too crazy and excited, your Shalombush could jump out, because that's what Shalombush do. It'll jump out, and it holds the memory of these things, and it won't come unless you call it. It stays where it jumps out. So you have to be sure to call it. So you get called. So my mom would be standing right here, and I'd be right here, and she'd be like, "Karina!" I'm like, "Oh, Mom, I'm growing up in Hollywood. Why are you doing that?" She's like, yeah. And so that's what. So we talked about that, and then all of a sudden, Michelle and I had an aha moment that we understood PTSD. The Shalombush is what we call disassociation. And in the flashbacks from PTSDs, because what the Shalombush does is it comes outside of you, and your Shillip is that shell. People talk about feeling like they're a shell, and they just walk around, and they don't have that affect, and they don't have anything. That's the Shillip. And the danger is you can have Nalusophilia come in you, right, which is the soul eater. So we have stories for all of this. That's the darkness, the depression. But the PTSD we have too. So the Shalombush jumps outside of you. You have to call it back. The Shalombush holds the memory, and it'll stay in the place of trauma. That's the flashbacks. So all of a sudden we're like, our ancestors had stories and had ceremonies and had ways of understanding this. How can we begin to think about bringing that back? So I'll end on that. That's a little bit about our project, and we came back and we did it again. Just a couple of pictures. I don't have time to share. I was going to share digital stories, but this is our first group that went. And our young one here, I just want to say, Alaya, she was 12. And these are the parent-child pairs. And it turns out that Carrie and I are cousins. We didn't know it, so you never know when you go on these trips. But Alaya, this would made it worthwhile. By the third day, when we had our group meeting, we were having our talking circle, and she said, "I get it now. I get what I need to do." And I'm like, "Oh, what is it?" And she said, "If I'm just a happy teenager, I'm healing the future generations, and I'm healing the past generations. If I'm just a happy teenager." I'm like, done. Done. So that's it. So thank you. Yakoke. Thank you.
A few minutes for questions or comments.
Yeah.
Kia ora, Karina.
Kia ora.
Some of my research is around visions, so definitely Greg is also interested in talking about the revealed knowledge, and one of the aspects around historical trauma I want to ask you about is in events that happen historically, somehow energetically still seem to be present in the land.
Oh yeah.
And people, a couple of the cases I'm including in my study, Pākehā woman in the Abel Tasman Park on a women's retreat, walked into an area and felt like she walked into a bubble and had this full-blown 3D experience of a massacre.
Yeah.
She had no idea of the history.
Yeah.
And so I was just wondering, from your border around historical trauma, where that would fit in, just see your border about environmental trauma, spiritual trauma.
Yeah.
And very interested in looking at that aspect.
Yeah. Kia ora, thank you. We were really, that was one of the reasons we were concerned about the young people going with us, especially. We all talked a lot about that issue, and we actually talked with some of our medicine people about these things. And we had some things to prepare and do every single day that we were on the trail. Now, the problem was getting everyone to do that, and that wasn't always the case. We learned something very valuable very quickly. We knew that we might encounter two things. One is we knew not to be so arrogant to think that no one else is already, and our ancestors didn't have some ability to do some cleaning along the trail. And we had one elder said to us, you know, don't go looking for anything, but in case you do bump into something, here's what to do. And he said, but most likely a lot has already been done because a lot of people have walked through. We have people who do that kind of thing to take care of things. However, on that first day, in the first 24 hours, we had since, give you an example of an experience, we had a group of young people walked into a cemetery. Now, there's all these things about that culturally, and I didn't go, and I told the young person who was with me not to go, and Michelle and her daughter were like, no, we're not going in there. And when they walked in, tornado, like a big giant dust devil, we call them, they're like tornadoes, came up out of the cemetery and moved into the cornfield. And they didn't see that, Michelle and her daughter, but I did. And then when they started coming back out, I said, Michelle, look, watch the cornfield. And sure enough, when they walked out, that tornado came back up and walked right back in. That was just the first morning. And by that night, we had visits. And one of our young people actually got visited by some children asking for help, and really, really freaked her out. And she had never had an experience like that. But we had ceremonies, and we knew what to do to take care of that and make sure she was safe and turn down the volume and take care of our people. But you have to be mindful of the responsibilities that you're doing when you're taking on something like that. So I think that's really important. The other thing is we realized we couldn't clean everybody and everything, so we had to make sure that we were able to stay in our process and honor and but the mistake we had made, that I had made as one of the leaders there, was that we had our kids participating in some of the ceremonies with us at the beginning as a way of modeling and teaching. Like simple things like making prayer ties and putting out spirit plates, which aren't a big deal generally, but on the trail it was. And what happened was the reason why she got visited is she and her mom put out the spirit plate, but when she put it out, she said she wanted to help. And she didn't know what she was doing. And so sure enough, so we said, listen, you've done your part. But out of that whole experience is what she got out of that is I don't need to mess with all of that. I just need to be a healthy young kid, and then I can, that's my way of helping. So she got actually a very important lesson. So that's a long story, but that night a screech owl came. And to us, when Iskatini comes and doesn't do its normal owl behaviors, it means death is coming. And sure enough, that morning we got a call that one of the women's brother was passing. So that was the first 24 hours. So.
As an Indigenous being, you're constantly walking between two different realms, the spiritual and the physical. So can you share with us as Indigenous researchers who actually understand the importance of wairua and spirituality, how do you keep yourself sane? Because you're responsible for so many beings on the trail, and I really appreciate you acknowledging perhaps some of the wairua tapu sacred things that happen. But you know, while we're all fired up to make a difference with our communities and from the communities, we do need to acknowledge that wairua actually controls everything we do and delivered our bicultural westernized ignorance as much as we like. But once we reach out as Indigenous beings, we have control.
That's another story.
So, yes, so can you share with us?
Yeah.
Would like to.
Yeah.
How do you survive this navigation?
I actually, it was one of the most challenging experiences I've ever had, because it was a convergence of my spiritual practices and worlds and my research worlds, and being a director and feeling immense responsibility for everybody. It was actually very, very challenging. The second time wasn't as challenging because I was better prepared. I knew more what to expect. But what we learned out of that first time is the importance of rising into your leadership roles. That what we did was we were so busy trying to respect everybody that in that process, when certain spiritual things or certain things just needed to happen, instead of doing it kind of, because I did it, but or one of us would do it, but it would have to be, it wasn't as a community. And so what we did differently is said, no, we will make the decisions. And when, you know, there was a rising into one's spiritual and research leadership in all of our roles. And it was actually very important. That's why going on the second trip, we realized we needed to do that. So a good example was one of the sites the young people picked at the last one. None of us liked it. We knew it was, we just knew it. And we said no. And then they picked a second site that we still didn't like it. We just knew it wasn't right. It was unsettled. But because we wanted to please the young people, we went along with it. And that was the night we had the craziness. And this trip, it happened again. They said, no, we want to go over there. And the three of us said, Sandy, Michelle, and I, because we were kind of we're the cultural leaders on that part of it. And we said, no, no. And they're like, they were getting all, you know, we didn't care because we have the responsibility. So that's part of it, was arising. But for those who have that responsibility, there's a time to arise in that leadership, and it needs to happen. So it's for the protection.
Thank you. I'm going to stop the questions now. Please join me in thanking Karina.
Yes, thank you.
We're going to adjourn to the A block tea room, but I would ask that you don't snaffle Greg and Karina now. Let them go up to the tea room so they can get some water and ready for lunch. And please join us, and then you can talk to them. And don't be shy, but then don't crowd them in. Good, everyone.
Good. Oh, no, that's okay. Thank you, Linda.
So there's some things in there that have explanations.
Awesome. Thank you. There's a beautiful basket.